Welcome to Future Squared, the podcast all about corporate innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-empowerment. Future Squared brings you a double dose of innovation inspiration every week to help you and your company stay relevant in an era of rapid change and 10x your results in both your professional and personal life. Each week, I'll bring you corporate innovators, entrepreneurs, authors, keynote speakers, and thought leaders such as Steve Blank, David Allen, Brad Feld, Tim Harford, Karen Dillon, Jenny Blake, Neil Patel, Rand Fishkin, Pascal Finette, Ryan Blair, and Ash Moria, to name just a few. While every Friday, I'll bring you Fast Fix Friday, some quick, digestible insights to help you end your week on a high as you head off for the weekend. Future Squared is brought to you by Collective Campus, an innovation hub school of consultancy based in Melbourne, Australia and Singapore that works with companies to help them adopt the mindset, methods and tools to navigate change and survive and thrive in an era of rapid disruption. If your organization needs help coming up with ideas, testing and turning ideas into reality, incubating teams, driving cultural change, or connecting and partnering with startups, then visit www.collectivecamp.us. And without further ado, here's today's podcast. Welcome back to Future Squared for episode number 191 with Bernard Leong. Bernard is currently the head of Post Office Network and Digital Services at Singapore Post. He's an angel investor within the Southeast Asia entrepreneurial ecosystem, and he's founder and host of the Analyse Asia podcast, where he interviews thought leaders from across Asia and the US on business, media, and technology. Bernard is an entrepreneur in residence for INSEAD Business School, where he advises MBA students on product development, connecting to the local startup and venture community. Expect to learn many things in this episode, including 1. How Bernard secured buy-in from internal stakeholders and regulators for new initiatives such as a drone delivery project. 2. The power of quick wins. And 3. What a large company needs in order to support entrepreneurial thinkers. So with that, I bring you the one and only Bernard Leong. Welcome to the show, Bernard.
Well, thank you, Steve, for inviting me on the show.
No, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the program, and Future Squared listeners will remember you, definitely. I mean, many of them also no doubt listen to your show, but particularly they'll remember episode number 158 of Future Squared, which was basically a republication of an Analyse Asia episode. So I'm happy to turn the tables and interview you today, Bernard. Really looking forward to this chat. But before we go into it, I was hoping you could give our audience a 2,000-foot view of who Bernard Leong is.
Well, I'm Bernard Leong. Currently, my job is the head of Post Office Network and Digital for Singapore Post, which is the publicly listed company in Singapore. And on my spare time, I would be actually the founder of a podcast called Analyse Asia, which is a weekly podcast dedicated to talk about tech, business, and media in Asia. So I started off as a theoretical physicist. I had my PhD in physics from Cambridge, then worked as a postdoc researcher in the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute. Then I decided to go into the business world. So I got into startup. I ran a company called Chalkboard, which raised money from Joey Ito, the head of MIT lab. It didn't work out. It crashed, it burned. And I decided that I would do another startup at some point in time. But in the same time, I ran another company a media company called SG Entrepreneurs, which I think a lot of people will be familiar with my co-founder, Gwendolyn Tan. That was sold to Tech in Asia. So actually my media roots go a bit back in time. So I decided that before I go embark on the next startup, I need to understand how to scale a company. And the best place to actually do that is to be in a corporate environment, because all corporate environments were originally startups in their past lives. So this is where you can learn things, you can actually how to manage more people. And so I went to join Vistaprint first as a technology manager. And in that role was interesting, where he and the C-suite people give me ideas and I have to deploy one idea, assemble a 4-man team, and build the innovative product and then transition into their business unit. So that actually gave me a very good lens of where the dynamics actually are. Then subsequently, I was supposed to join Amazon US, but the former CEO of SingPost, Wolfgang Bayer, came to me and said, I'll offer you a role that will be 10 times more challenging and half the pay. So I took it. I became the head of digital. It was the job that I wanted. Yeah. Basically, I became a senior executive, and we did some great work like bringing Alibaba's investment to the landscape.
That's fantastic. I love that, Bernard. And I love what you said there about, joining Singapore Post to do 10 times the work for half the pay, which is very true of entrepreneurship. A lot of entrepreneurs complain about, say, working 60 hours at a large consulting firm, but then they quit and they end up working 100 hours to do their own thing, and they barely pay themselves anything. But there is that underlying sort of impact creation that keeps them driven and keeps them moving forward. And I know what you said earlier in your spiel there was about chalkboard. And when you joined that company or started that company, it was because you wanted to create more impact. And do you see, in your work that you've been doing, whether it's with SyncPost, whether it's with Vistaprint, whether it's with people that you've spoken to on your podcast, which we'll talk about in a second, that desire to create impact is at the center of everything they do?
I think one of the things that I always like to tell people is I like to build things. I like to spend time building things to impact other people's lives. So yes, that's right. I believe that as an educated person, my value is to contribute back to society. But I think I'm not best at trying to look at spreadsheets and see how numbers move. I'll be much more useful in building products that actually help people to make their lives better, which is what I've been doing in the past 6 years in a corporate environment.
Yeah. And I guess, speaking of the corporate environment and impact creation, when it comes to attracting and retaining talent that wants to create impact, how do you feel most corporates are dealing with this question? Because from my perspective, it seems like a lot of corporates are still trying to incentivize talent with extrinsic motivation, whether it's pay, bonuses, trips, and all sorts of stuff, company junkets, things of that nature. But ultimately, what often gets overlooked is the fact that people are willing to work for your company for much less than you actually are proposing to pay them, providing you give them that freedom to go out and create impact and do meaningful work. So, what have your observations been in this space when it comes to companies doing stuff that can actually attract and retain that sort of entrepreneurial impact seeking talent?
This is an interesting question because I was asked many times by different startup founders about joining the corporate world to do entrepreneurship or maybe leading their digital or innovation teams. And I think that a lot of it on retaining people is actually giving the autonomy and the space for these people to work within your organization. But I think the important part when it comes to thinking about digital transformation and disruption, particularly in bringing a startup founder like myself into a corporate organization, is not so much about the startup founder because he has the skill set, the agility, the way of how to build a startup. It's actually more about the corporation's DNA. Meaning the corporation itself, whether they have that innovation DNA to start off with. I would probably say in my role in SyncPost, I've done some of my best work there. I would probably say that they did have that innovation DNA within them, even though they were started off as a government agency and merged with Singapore Telecoms, which eventually became Singtel and spin off as a public listed company. They have actually created two major innovations in their time. One of them was the PAM, which became the SAM machine, is actually called the SyncPost Automated Machine. It's a kiosk that does payments, selling postage. And then the other thing is parcel lockers, which they actually failed twice before doing it the third time in 2013. That becomes today the Pop Station, which is a very successful product in SyncPost. So they must have the DNA to start first in order to allow me to be able to work with their DNA as well.
So a couple of things I wanted to explore there, Bernard. Firstly, you said, SyncPost had the DNA and, they were open to failure because you mentioned the parcel lockers failed twice before finally getting it right the third time. But what does that actually mean to you? What does having the innovative DNA or the innovator's DNA at a large organization mean to you insofar as, say, process, technology, policies, culture is concerned?
When I joined SyncPost at the point in time was under the leadership of Dr. Wolfgang Bayer, the former CEO. So I think there were a few conditions that he set right to allow that corporate innovation to actually happen. First of all, the senior management has to be digital. So meaning that whether it's himself or everyone else, if you be a group COO, a group CIO, we're all digital people. We converse in digital language, we use digital tools. Second is that we percolate that not from top down, but bottoms up. So one of the open secrets that probably a lot of people didn't know is that whether you're a C-level person all the way down to being a middle manager, you actually go down to the ground and work either as a customer service officer, a telesales call, or a courier. I've done about some Christmas deliveries, and actually worked 4 times as a post office service ambassador. And the way we think about this is actually pretty interesting. So you're thinking about digital transformation. If you don't feel the pain of your frontline customer, right, the frontline service ambassador, who is also your internal customer and also the external customer, then how are you going to build things that actually digitally transform the company? Right, you have to build things that align both, because a lot of companies always like to think about the external digital transformation, slap a nice UI, put some nice cool iOS app. No, it doesn't work like that, because it has to integrate with the internal operations. So in the case where we did the design of the new version of the SAM platform, I actually put in a process to look at the internal operations. That has to be so easy that the person who's actually helping me to make changes to the machine, like replacing a printer label, has to be seamless. So that in that process, they also enjoy working the machine itself. So I think that's something that when we think about digital transformation, you need to align. It's about alignment of different stakeholders, actually.
Yeah, definitely. I think alignment is key. And, whenever we're working with organizations, step one, we always say you need to identify those key stakeholders and align them to the mission and have those key metrics in place. Because if you go into it from day one with your typical, say, traditional financial metrics as the measure of success, and, 3 or 6 months later, you're not hitting, say, the ROI or the net present value, it can put a spanner in the works. And so getting people aligned from day one is key. And I like what you said there about bottom up. And getting out there and actually being on the front line of the service delivery. And I guess you're taking a leaf out of Toyota's book there with the Genshu Genbutsu approach. Go and see for yourself.
Yeah, and just to give you a really interesting story, this is told to me by my former group CIO Ramesh. So on the very first day, he was working as a post office service ambassador. Mm-hmm. He saw one of the post office, I think it's Tanglin post office, one of the probably the higher end post offices in Singapore. He saw that the keyboard was totally black, meaning all the keys had faded. While we're talking about digital transformation, what's the first thing to do? Immediately he called up his department and say, can you please send a new keyboard to this post office?
That's hilarious, but it's so true.
But there is a very indicative step, right? Because if you don't even do the basic things right, then how are you going to do the bigger things where like you're going to change an entire legacy system, where you're trying to move from physical servers to cloud? You need to have certain, what I call small steps that actually build towards the big change. And I think that's the journey of my work in SingPost across the last 4 years in digital transformation. You have to be very patient. Mm-hmm. You are building two systems, one that is actually moving very fast, that's actually getting a lot of traction. And then at the same time, you need to rebuild a legacy system and get it integrated with the new system.
Yeah, and I think we touched on this topic on our conversation on Future Squared, where we talked about the value of getting those quick wins. And you've mentioned there starting with some of the basic things until that's effectively going to set you up so you can go off and start making those bigger changes. So what sort of quick wins or basic things other than getting the keyboards updated have you been working on, say, in the past 4 years, and then perhaps we can move from there to start looking at the bigger change that's underway at SingPost?
I like to tell the story that when I first joined SingPost, I told my boss, don't give me a budget, don't give me anything, just give me what resources you can give me that I inherit. So I actually inherited a digital team that was actually pretty innovative and very fun to work with. And they're a little bit low morale because nobody cares about what they do. So what I did with them is I focused a lot on their efforts. Instead of trying to solve one of the bigger problems, I focused on them solving very, very quick problems. So for starter, one of the things that which I think in Singapore is pretty rare, usually most chief digital officers doesn't own the P&L. So I'm one of the two that owns the P&L. Yeah. And because of that, my mandate becomes a little bit more challenging because I have to produce a P&L, right? And at the same time, I can't make big jumps in innovation. That means I can't do anything disruptive. So I have to do things that incremental, that's able to build up my team's confidence over time. So one of the things I did was I actually went to meet up with all my other counterparts, the other heads of departments. For example, the head of logistics, this very great lady who did the parcel locker, Annie. And when we discussed, and the first thing I asked her, what are the most important digital problems you want to solve? And she gave me a list, and one of them happens to be a mobile app. So I said, yeah, I'll volunteer to help you. Let's get this done. And the original specs of that mobile app was actually a lot of features, and it's not going to be done in 3 months. So I said, you have to strip away 19 of that features out of 20 and tell me what's the one thing you want that will make people use this app. And then every 1-2 months, you keep updating it. And we came down to this feature. We actually became a case study to many many consultancies, whether it's Forrester or IDC, is on the parcel locker is called the pop station in Singapore. And actually it's a very simple feature. Basically, a lot of people has to queue in front of the parcel locker to actually collect the parcels itself. So the thing is that Singaporeans hate queuing. What if I can create something on the mobile app that can unlock the parcel locker and tell you specifically which locker to go to and open it? So we call that feature Air Unlock. We implemented in iOS first. And that feature became something that's very popular with the users, and it created a subculture of Instagrams with people doing selfies on the parcel locker. I collected my parcel, and then of course with events like delivering Xiaomi phones, you have the Chinese customers doing that too.
Oh, fantastic. Now, I actually love that story because it's so common for organizations when they want to embark upon some new product delivery to, want to have all the bells and whistles, and ultimately 90% of the time, most of those bells and whistles aren't even required. But the problem that it does create is these products become very complex, they become costly, they take a lot longer than need to, and ultimately you also have too many chiefs on the bus. You might having a steering committee or something like that, and that ultimately results in massive cost blowouts, and things take forever, and the benefits realization is often an afterthought. So I love the fact that you were able to just strip things right back to the number one key feature. What's the number one problem we're solving here? Who is it for? And what's the one key feature that's going to solve, say, 80% of the problem? Taking that 80-20 Pareto principle approach to product development.
Although this is an incremental innovation, it actually led to a disruptive innovation. So the collaboration with Anne went very well, the head of logistics. And when Wolfgang came to us with the drone delivery problem, it became very interesting because she was already supporting me and said, Bernard, we should just do the drone delivery project. And I can talk a little bit about the project and maybe tell you the backstory, how this actually come about. Because we actually went from something very incremental to very disruptive within Singapore itself.
Yeah, and I think one of the key things there to note before we go on into the drone story is you're talking about how giving the team these easier or sort of quick win projects was one way to build confidence, or their confidence. But it also seems like it built confidence in the team from outside or from across the organization, as was the case there with Anne.
Yeah, that's right. So what actually happens is that when we actually develop more and more features for them on the mobile app, and also helping her with how to design their web properties and the way they design logos as well, we basically built a very good, strong relationship between both teams. So it actually sets up what we need for actually much more complex and much more bigger projects. And that was how the drone delivery actually came to be in Next. I think a lot of people underappreciate that, it's very easy to embark on a very disruptive technology project, but without internal alignment within a big organization, you can forget it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and you might get initial buy-in, but maintaining that buy-in over 6 months or 12 months can often be a challenge. And I guess just on the buy-in factor, you mentioned initially that senior management have to be digital, they have to get it, and you've got that bottom-up engagement. But what, if any, metrics did you have in place, particularly in the early stages of, say, exploring some type of quote-unquote disruptive idea that would keep people on the bus? Because often there is a tendency to focus on trailing indicators like revenue, as opposed to some of those leading indicators like validating the problem. 9 out of 10 people we spoke to said that was the problem, for example.
So I think we had a mandate to actually make sure that there will be high utilization for the pop station, because it's in this initial stage of rolling out. Where we wanted to focus on the metric that would really matters is the Net Promoter Score of the user.
Yeah.
So that was very key to us, because one of the key values in SingPost is total customer. So the customer centricity piece is very important to us. So we focus on trying to reach the highest NPS scores for that particular, for customers who are engaged with us through the parcel lockers itself. So I think and then of course we have to have an internal arrangement of how her team, her P&L pays to me as an internal revenue. That means we help her to build. Yeah. On that.
Love that. And so with the Net Promoter Score, I imagine initially when you started testing the product, that Net Promoter Score perhaps was a little bit lower than it is, say, today. Now, I mean, what did those conversations sound like in terms of saying, hey, here we are at the moment, we're at, say, a Net Promoter Score of 5, and here's what we plan to do to get it to, say, 50, for example. I mean, just wanting to understand that conversation, because I feel that's an important one insofar as maintaining that support from key stakeholders is concerned.
I will be pretty upfront. So when we roll out the pop station, because I think we were very deliberate about how we wanted to deploy. So it started off with a pretty good Net Promoter Score. So to just help the audience, Net Promoter Score, usually you have a scale of 1 to 10. You count the frequency of people scoring 9, 10, which we call the promoters, and then against the people who score 1 to 6, which are called the detractors, and in between 7 to 8 is actually the what I call passives. And then you take the difference between the promoters versus the detractors, and you get a Net Promoter Score. So I think the question for us at that point in time is, how do we ensure that, because there were also rival parcel lockers coming up from startups, so we wanted to make sure that the experience was really different, that they can't replicate it. So we focus on using this whole air unlock concept, that they can actually be, when they move close to that pop station, it will give them a notification that you're near some parcel locker that you can actually collect your package. So we focus a lot on getting the mind share of the customer.
Yeah. And what you said there about focusing on the experience being fundamentally different and better than what the startups are coming up with, I think that's a key point as well, because ultimately you've got to be 10x better. You can't just be a little bit better or a little bit cheaper. Otherwise, people's habits aren't going to change. And I guess on becoming that much better and having that key feature, the unlocking feature, I mean, how did you stumble upon that? I mean, was this through design sprints with customers? Was this through internal brainstorming sessions? How did that come about?
I looked at their customer survey reports. I also took a look at how they initially came to some of the sets of features. I took a little bit more deep dive into putting the user experience together and talk to the team. And through a few discussions, that's how we got to that this is probably the feature that we should use to unlock the parcel locker. So it's not as deliberate as saying that, oh, we have how many design sprints, because they already done the work earlier. Where I came in was, okay, you already have all this data. Let me look for some secondary insight that we have not seen it before.
And when you landed on that feature, I imagine there was a step between, okay, this is what we think it is, and full scale deployment. Was there any sort of initial testing to confirm that, okay, this is going to work? What did that look like?
Everybody thinks it's a very easy feature to implement. Actually, it's a very difficult feature to implement. Let me explain why. Let me give you 2 edge cases that will actually cause the whole thing to fall apart. So this air unlock feature is actually, to me, is a implementation of Internet of Things IoT sensor with the smartphone, right? But the thing is that in the market, people don't talk about it as that. People just talk about, oh, it's just the air unlock, right? So that means we succeeded. That means the design is embedded right inside. Where it becomes tricky is when the customer is close to the pop station. Let me give you a scenario. Say if you are on 1 floor above or 1 floor below in the shopping mall near the pop station, does the Bluetooth signal able to tap into your phone and say, hey, you're near a pop station, but actually you're nowhere near the pop station because you're 1 floor up and 1 floor down, right? That's one problem. Second problem is, are you really that near to the pop station that you can air unlock? So imagine you air unlock 1 floor up and 1 floor down, right? So it opens, but you're there. So we have to design that precision that you are really Joe fans within the area that you can see the pop station. And then the second part is actually the unlock side, because we needed to make sure that the lock has to open. You have to pick it up. And what's the error rate of you pushing back the door back in and it locks back in?
Yeah.
How do you deal with that experience? So we did a lot of trial and error to make sure that the experience is right.
Yeah, and that's a challenge I've had at a number of theme parks over the years, where you drop off your bag in one of those self-serve lockers and you go to pick it up and you accidentally close the door, and then you need to speak to a customer service rep to get your bag again. Anyways, but yeah, it's never a great experience. So understanding that end-to-end customer journey, where are the risks, where are the potential pain points, and let's design around that. I think that makes a hell of a lot of sense. And so you mentioned earlier that the initial quick win work you did with Anne evolved into a drone delivery program that you guys are working on. What can you tell us about that?
So the story was that after we did the successful rollout of the mobile app with Pop Station, I was helping her to think about how the evolution of parcel lockers are going to go towards. Mm-hmm. So one thing that came up was, I think, a couple of drone flags, for example, DHL, Amazon. So what we thought is that actually you can think of using drones, not for consumer use, but for enterprise use, where you can take the drones to actually pick and replace parcel lockers in the urban logistics world. So you can think of in night logistics, you have all these parcel lockers distributed across the islands, and within 4 km, you can actually take the drone, pick a parcel locker from one location, travel 1 km, drop into the other. Mm-hmm. So we were internally developing that project. What was funny was Wolfgang came back to the office one day after having lunch with the former CEO of the Infocom Development Authority. Now it's called Infocom and Media Development Authority. And she became the CEO of GovTech, Jacqueline Poe. And he said, "Bernard, can you fly a drone?" So that got me a little bit shocked and say, well, Wolfgang, if you want to fly a drone, then we have to have a business problem, right? I'm not going to fly a drone because we're going to be satisfy our vanity.
Yeah,
satisfy our vanity, right? Metrics, right? But I didn't say no to him. So I said, Wolfgang, give me a weekend. Let me figure this out. Let me try to look around to see if there are real problems within the company that can be solved by a drone delivery. So I went back, and the interesting part is, as I work in SingPost, I kept what I call the problems list. Mm-hmm. It's actually the whole list of problems that's given to me by all the different heads of department, whether it's mail, logistics, e-commerce. And then I would just pick on each one of them and decide who to collaborate if they decided that they want to work with me. So it turns out that there was a problem. What actually happened is that we have an offshore island called Pulau Ubin. Mm-hmm. And we have recorded a postman that was now, I think, probably age 74, twice from retirement, to deliver about 150 letters 3 times a week. Yeah. He takes a boat over, he walks through the whole island, and then he knows every household by heart. And then, the problem is very simple. We couldn't find a successor. Yeah. And no one wants to take a boat out to the island in today's world. Yeah. So then it became interesting, because would you be able to think of a scenario where, let's do a drone delivery, you fly in a box of letters into the island and basically have someone over the other side to actually collect that box and then distribute within. Most likely would be a native within the island itself, and we can actually pay that person for doing that work for us. So that actually has some implications to how postal technology really works. If you think about it, right, what is traditional postal delivery? It is a sender and recipient relation. You, a sender, sends me a letter, right? Nobody knows who you are. All you have is the address of the recipient. And the recipient has a mailbox and has a key. Your key is actually the secure authentication that's required for you to open and then collect the letter. Of course, 99.9% that you will definitely receive the correct letter that's sent to your address. That's how the traditional postal works. Yep. So in the drone delivery world, you can think about the same thing, right? You still have the sender and the recipient. The sender puts the mail onto the drone flies to the designated location, but how does the recipient actually open the mailbox, right? So it turns out that what we learn in parcel lockers has actually taught us a few things. It's actually in the reverse. Instead of us actually air unlock the locker to open, right? Now you could think of the situation of you holding a smartphone and the drone reaches the location and hanging on mid-air. You send an authentication signal to the drone and it verifies that it's you. It will land, you pick up the package and it flies back to its original location. If within 3 minutes you don't get that authentication signal, then the drone should just fly back to the delivery base and say that the delivery failed. So it actually has significance in how we think about drone delivery in the modern digital world. So one thing I did was actually watch every video that was done by every postal agency out there, Amazon, DHL. And what I saw was everyone just flew the thing, dropped the package somewhere. And I think in the DHL case was very interesting. They dropped the package of medication in a hospital. How would I not know whether the person picked it up is a patient or a medical worker?
Yeah.
You see? So that defies the whole spirit of what postal means, right? So when we design that experience, we actually use what we learned from the parcel locker, and that actually made the whole drone delivery, because we were just expecting local coverage. We didn't expect that Forbes would have covered it. We didn't expect even Bloomberg covered it, because of that part that we explained. What does it mean being secure and what does it mean being authenticated?
Yeah, and I think that's such a key point as well, because you took this learning from an earlier engagement and brought it forward into something much bigger, where the applications or the implications for it can be quite widespread and could have global applications. But I guess that's something that oftentimes isn't done all that well in companies, where we might have a learning, and it could be a learning that comes from a successful project or a failed project oftentimes, but then that learning isn't really shared or distributed in a way that supports us building upon that learning or taking that learning and importing it into another project. So on that point, I mean, how have you found the approach to, say, knowledge management or sharing learnings from failures and successes at SingPost? Is this something that there is a conscious effort towards supporting? Or
I think because they have done so many innovations, they have also done some failures in making those innovations work. I think there is a general there's a general method, I think, that the people has actually conveyed when someone suggested the same idea that was done again 10 years ago. But I think where you have to apply a skeptical mind is to say, okay, it failed 10 years ago. Can you tell me what happened?
Yeah. What were the factors that prevented it from being successful?
That's right. Because the parcel lockers example was very clear. When they did it in 1998, it failed because there was no e-commerce. By the time it hit 2003, e-commerce wasn't prevalent in the Southeast Asia market or even in Singapore. But by 2013, number of parcel packages entering to Singapore has actually grown exponentially. So that has changed the calculus of what parcel lockers are supposed to
do. So this drone, Bernard, is it now in full scale production to the island, or?
No, not yet, because the unit economics is not there yet.
Yes,
but it brought Airbus helicopters to SingPost, and there is a project called Project Skyways, which is actually talking about drones and parcel locker delivery. So they actually developed the original project that we wanted to develop.
Excellent.
But except that I don't need to build a drone, so I just need to build a service.
Well, that's it. And that's the thing, right? Oftentimes companies that we've worked with will often come to us and say, well, we want to build this thing. And it's like, well, you can actually empower other organizations to build the thing, and you can be the customer and give them more incentive to build it. And by the way, they're probably going to be much better at building this thing than you are, but you're going to be better at the other side of it. So I think there's a lesson in that. But I was going to ask about the regulatory aspects of flying a drone to the island. Is this something that you looked into? I imagine you would have as part of your sort of business case development for it.
Yes, and actually the interesting part of the story was we went in as a public-private partnership with the IDA Labs. So they advise us on how to deal with the authorities. So I have to align 5 different agencies, the police, the military, the Civil Aviation Authority, and the Port Authority, and also Homeland Security as well. Now, what we did was I actually set a timeline for the project, which makes it very challenging as well, because we started in June 2015, and I told them that we have to get it done by 9 October 2015. And the government's like, nobody ever gets us to do this in 3 months. I said, well, we have a World Post Day, and I know that about another 15 posts out there is going to try to announce something like this to the world on the same day. So we have to be the first. So I gave the incentive to them. And I think Singapore government has two functions. One is regulatory, but the other one is industrial promotion. So there's also an eagerness to build themselves to be an aviation hub. So when we were talking to the biggest challenge we had was with Civil Aviation Authority, because where the biggest battle was actually to prove airworthiness. We actually, for every test flight, every trial, we invited all the stakeholders from various agencies to come to see. We did endurance tests on the drone. We did things like even flying at high wind chill factors. So they came and see. They were satisfied by how we mitigate risks, but the Civil Aviation Authority wasn't very happy about it. So in the end, it got down to a very interesting battle of what airworthiness really means. So this is the best part. I am a trained theoretical physicist with a PhD from Cambridge, physics. So during one of the discussions, which is actually one of the final discussions, the regulator side officer told me that the physics of the plane is equivalent to the physics of the quadcopter, which is a drone. And that became a joke from everybody, and everybody was like looking at them, was like, what are you trying to say? So I actually did have support from the very top down, but I decided that if I have to do that, then we violated the whole spirit of trying to get this passed, right? So I wrote to his immediate supervisor and said, here's how I would like to explain this. How could you this is what the flight wants to achieve. This is the drone that we built. It satisfies these requirements, but in no way that it could satisfy the requirements of a commercial plane. I guess only Airbus and Boeing can do that, right? Yeah. So I wrote it in that way. And what I would suggest is, may I propose that you do not take my side? Why don't you have a meeting with both of us in that room, and then you understand whether we're taking this in the right way. So I actually let the system test itself. So the next person came in, they brought a referee. They also brought in a referee from the Futures Division from Ministry of Transport. And in the end, the CAAS considered that was a moot point, and they let us fly in the end.
Oh, that's a great story. I love the theme there about how you went about getting buy-in, whether it was initially from police, military, the ports, but then also with civic aviation. And ultimately, you're looking for, firstly, what are the blockers and how do we get around that? I mean, it's not just a matter of them saying no and us, just feeling down about that, but ultimately, why did they say no? And is it warranted? And can we communicate or articulate better so that they can actually understand our position?
Yeah, I was very tempted. So on the day before the flight, there was actually a geek camp where the minister who's in charge of Smart Nation was actually going to be a guest. And I know the organizers. If I would want that 15 million audience with him, I could have got this happen from the very top down. But then you would violate the entire spirit. So I didn't show up in the geek camp, and everybody was wondering, where's Bernard? So the joke of it is that 6 months later, when I gave the talk for the Open Source Asia camp, I actually told them, well, that's the reason why I didn't show up. Because I had to let the system pass. Otherwise, nobody would be able to. And it was funny because some of the veterans there say that was the right way of doing it.
Yeah. And it's funny how you can get normally slow, large bureaucratic organizations and institutions to move when you can find something or incentivize them with something that they truly value. I mean, in your case, it was, Singapore wanting to position itself as a leader in aviation. Obviously, I mean, there's been other cases in history. For example, I recently spoke with Tim Harford, and he was telling the story of 1858 in London, where they referred to this period as the Great Stink, and it was just a very hot summer in London, and a lot of human waste was washing up on the River Thames. But the smell was so bad, and because Westminster House is basically on the River Thames, the smell was so bad that parliamentarians couldn't avoid it. They were leaving the house with rags covering their noses and all that sort of stuff, and that they passed a bill to effectively build an underground sewage system in just 14 days, whereas normally bills would take months and months and months to pass. But because they could actually, in this case, it wasn't show don't tell, it was smell don't tell, but it forced them to take action quickly. And in your case, it was more so, well, you want Singapore to be seen as a leader in innovation in aviation. We need to do this now, otherwise other countries are going to come in and announce something like this before us, and then it won't be such big news when we do it.
Well, the interesting part of the story is that the government agency, Civil Aviation Authority of Singapore, after we did the flight and we announced to the world, they became one of the top leading agencies with the most enlightened view on drone delivery. So they have a happy ending too. But I remember the day after we did the flight, everybody was on leave, and I went back to my office, starting typing letters. Actually, it was letters of appreciations to all the government agencies. My boss was like, "Why are you here? You should be on leave." He said, no, you need to sign these letters. So it's like we have to thank all these people for letting us fly.
That's beautiful.
I think it's also difficult on their part because it's something new and something disruptive, and we do not really know the implications of where this technology go. I have some profound appreciation to the regulators, and I empathize their perspective on this matter as well.
Well, yeah, of course. And the regulators are in a very difficult position, especially today where technology is moving so quickly. I mean, to make sense of all of the different emerging technology is a hard task in itself, but then to also appreciate what the implications are for consumers, who the regulator is ultimately set up to protect. Sometimes there is that balancing act between, well, are we regulating this a little bit too early and therefore we're not giving it the time and space it needs to evolve into something that could, profoundly impact humanity, or are we just dragging our feet and should we be clamping down on this? And, if you were to regulate the internet, say in 1992, then perhaps everything that came after it may have looked completely different. And now today, there's similar things going on with blockchain and initial coin offerings and all that sort of wild west of virtual currencies. And so regulators are in a very difficult position. And like you said, you can easily gain an appreciation for what they do just by engaging with them and having those conversations.
I think the drone delivery project has been one of the fun projects I have. It's actually my 20% project. I'm much more satisfied with one of the projects that has recently done very well, which is actually the smart post office. Is actually doing the future digital post office project.
Okay, well, talk to us a little bit about that.
So it started on my first day of work.
So
I was
4 years ago?
4 years ago. My group's chief operating officer, we had our first meeting, and he was in the midst of revamping the whole post office network because it requires the head of logistics, it requires different people to change the way how the post office is. And I remember the conversation we have. His name is Sasha Howard. He's now back with McKinsey. But one conversation we had on that very day was we were asking ourselves what the future post office would be. And then we came up with this view that actually the future post office, there will be 5 million post offices in Singapore.
5 million post offices? So every computer becomes a post office?
That's right. That means every smartphone, every tablet could be a post office. And the only things that you need to do in a post office is probably sending a package, collecting a package. Most of the services you can actually do digitally online. But then between that world and the world that we live in today, right, there will be intermediary. We still need physical post offices because we need to serve the silver generation, correct? But we also need to build an omni-channel digital platform that could serve the younger generation Singaporeans who can actually use that these services. This kind of customers requires a quick, instant gratification and access to services at the touch of speed of light. So what we started to do was we designed that new post office concept and we put in the icons on. So we changed the world of the language of the post office. People usually come to the post office and then you tell them what services that they need to do, right? We changed that language. We asked them, what do you want to do? So we went through a very customer-centric view. So typically customer comes to the post office, they want to buy, right? Buy postage labels or buy something. They want to send something, they want to collect something, they want to pay something, they want to remit money, remit something, right? So we turned all our customer flow into action based, so that, and we even put icons onto our walls, so to actually help them to move them towards certain services, and some of these services we move them to the self-serve. And at that point in time, the SAM machine is only in its 4th generation, and it doesn't have an omni-channel platform, meaning it doesn't have a web and a mobile part of the service. So over the last 3.5 years, we did the whole revamp of the SAM machine. It took us 3 years. Actually, it runs on an Apple iPad. The interesting story, probably very few people know, is Apple visited us twice to look at our innovation. They actually picked companies to visit. What was interesting was they even invited us to do the app for the watch before the watch was actually launched formally. That means they already announced the watch, but they wanted to have apps on the watch. So we actually did one of the first apps for the watch, and actually got an interaction with the Apple design team, which was a great learning experience for anyone who get into it, because we learn a lot about how they think about design through that. Yeah. So what we did was, we spent the time to relook at the flow of the customers, but we also relooked the flow of the customer service officer. And we built the web mobile version and the new kiosk into one omni-channel platform. And we let our customer service officers and the branch managers to be the beta testers, because they are all above 40. Average age of the customer service officers is about 40 years old and above. And they are in the world of Singapore, we call them my aunties. So one interesting thing is they like the experience. So I said, well, why don't we take the same design experience we have there and bring it to internally? So we redesigned the customer service counter, and then we brought in the same design that we had for the customer facing apps inside. So we actually rolling that out. It's called the internal SAM, which actually is the internal point of sale system, but it also has other modules like doing remittances, doing agency services, doing government services. And that experience is as good as if you have been using a Mac on the kiosk itself. So the idea behind is that once you have all the internal and the external stakeholders aligned with the user experience, it becomes also a good working environment for them. And at the same time, it increases their customer service. In fact, the post office in Singapore, we have the highest number of net promoter score within the organization. Not just for external customers, but for internal customers as well.
Oh, that's great, and you've got to keep the aunties happy, Bernard. So I like that you've rolled out that solution for them.
Well, the good news I can share is that we won 2 global awards, very prestigious one. One was the Post and Parcel Global Award for Retail Access. Interestingly, like a Champions League, we won it twice in a row. The previous year was the Pop Station.
Fantastic.
Which is the parcel locker. The second one, which I didn't think we were very lucky, because we have actually never won it twice in a row, was the Post and Parcel Technology Global Awards, where we won the Digital Innovation of the Year in 2017 this year for the SAM Omnichannel platform.
Wow. Well, congratulations on those acknowledgements. That's awesome.
Yeah. So we did put, to me, that is probably the most satisfactory part of my work as compared to the drone delivery, because I know that a lot of people know me through that. But this was probably much more satisfactory because it takes a lot of patience. It also takes a lot of, I have to endure a lot of pain and difficulty to try to make changes and also try to make alignment within the organization to get it to work the way we wanted it to work.
Yeah, and that can be quite rewarding. And not only that, but you're also impacting a lot more people as well across the organization by rolling out the solution.
Yeah, I think what better way to feel satisfied, because the old SAM machine, nobody uses it whenever I walk around shopping malls. But today when I walk around shopping malls, I see people using the new SAM machine. So, there's a kind of satisfaction that comes with building something people want to use.
Oh, of course. And it flies in the face of your traditional sort of product development approach where we may take 6 months to 12 months putting something to market, only then to realize that nobody wants it. And that can have the opposite effect, which can really hurt employee morale, where you're spending all this time and energy doing something that just doesn't create that impact. But when you do work on stuff where you know the customer, you do your work up front to understand what the customer wants, you deliver that, the customer uses it, that's a much more rewarding place to be. And then that morale just cycles forward into the next project, and that's how companies get the most out of their people.
For a startup founder who work in a big corporation, I think redesigning the SAM, which is actually a national icon for the last 20 years, and giving it a new lease of life, I felt that it was very satisfying. I think it's probably the most complex project that I've worked on because it integrates both hardware and software.
Yep.
So I felt that it's very important to also be very lean, very agile, but at the same time you also need to think about how do you align people, how do you make complex processes work, how do you redesign those processes? Because I think people forget about why those processes were there in the first place.
Yeah, and that's something that I often say. Building a startup is really hard. I mean, you haven't got much budget. You probably haven't got brand, capital, product. You're probably on a shoestring team as well with people that are very early in their sort of development because that's all you could afford. But trying to do innovation at a large company is not without its challenges. In fact, it can be just as challenging, if not more challenging, particularly when you're dealing with people whose mindset, values, the way they work, may be in direct sort of opposition to the way you need to behave to get stuff done and to push that through. And like you said, a big part of it is stakeholder management. So being an innovator in a large company can be very rewarding. And oftentimes startup founders might say, I don't want to go work for a large company. It's going to be soul sucking. But as you've clearly demonstrated there, it's one of the most, if not the most rewarding things you've done. And it was because it required so much effort. But at the end of it, there was that gold at the end of the rainbow.
Yeah, I think so too.
Fantastic. Look, we are almost out of time, but I wanted to just touch on one more thing before jumping into our lightning round, Bernard, and that was on the dual sort of transformation approach. You mentioned at the start of the conversation that effectively there's two systems. There's one which is all about, improving the legacy infrastructure, bringing that up to speed, but then the other system is fast. So what's that all about?
So typically in any digital transformation within a large corporation, there is a part of the company that's focused on the new and the shiny. So they have to be fast, they have to be agile, they have to deliver quick wins very quickly. I think this have no problems if you are very customer centric. Where people always have a problem is that when customers complain about something that you have, but actually it was the reason that what is happening is because of an old legacy system. And if you were to just take out that old legacy system, basically everything breaks down. Yeah. It's going to be even worse, right? Yeah. So I think a lot of the discussion has always gone on to the new, the shiny as well. But very few people actually look at the old legacy systems and actually give enough time for the digital teams to make that transition. Because there are two issues. One is cost. To change an old legacy system that works for a very long time has a lot of costs, right? The second is that the system, the operations, the processes, how do you change that process if you put in a new system? So you may find this very amusing. Changing from physical data centers to cloud took us 3 years. Yeah. Because we were actually running on physical data centers. But we knew that we have to move to the cloud, and the cloud has the same set of security. So we did it in very slow phases. I mean, you will imagine every other day I'll be calling my group friend, our group CIO, and say, hey, can we move to the cloud? Can we move to the cloud? And he would be like, no. I know, but if I were to do this, this whole thing will break. So I have to learn to be patient about that. And I think that there needs to be a way to convey to customers, because there are some things that customers want us to do. But when it's with a few close friends, I would just say, well, the reason that why this is not happening is because we have two systems and we need to fix the system first before I can actually allow this to happen. Yeah, I know that once it will happen, you guys will be very happy, but it doesn't. Reality is a little bit more complicated than how you think it is.
Yeah, of course, and it's that classic sort of approach where it's not just a matter of taking a broken process and just digitizing it, or a process that was developed based on the technology that was available 10, 20, or 30 years ago. Sometimes you need to redesign the structures and the systems around it before you can digitize it. And similarly, if we go back to the start of the 20th century, moving from steam to electricity, it wasn't just a matter of replacing the battery in, say, a big factory. You needed to redesign everything around that, the entire ecosystem, to get the most out of electricity. And it took 30 to 40 years for that sort of evolution to happen. So, like you said, patience is a virtue.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, Bernard, well, look, I cannot let you go without throwing you into our 3-question lightning round. And I'm sure you've heard these questions before, so I imagine you're going to be just quick as attack on these.
Okay, let's go.
Okay, well, question number 1 is, if you could work for any organization at any stage of the company lifecycle, Bernard, who would it be and why?
You will probably be Google, and you'll probably be at the starting phase of the company.
Yep, so back in the mid-90s.
Yep.
Fantastic. And why would that be?
Because that's where you really get to work on the hard problems, like making sure that there are millions of search results being stored properly in servers. There was no cloud then. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, exactly.
It may sound easy today. We have a lot of cloud servers with Amazon Web Services, but in that point in time, it's probably a very difficult problem.
Oh, yeah. And I still remember how, we had the likes of Alta Vista and Lycos and all these other so-called search engines are just being absolutely polluted with people hacking the system, where if you searched for, say, cars or something like that, you'd get ads for porn popping up because you just have the word cars on those porn sites hidden on, black text on a black background, and people were just gaming the system. So there was a lot to think about that previously wasn't documented.
That's right.
So it's an exciting time. Question number 2 is, if you could ask anyone a question, dead or alive, who would it be and what would you ask?
I would ask, his name is Jose Mourinho. He's currently the manager of Manchester United. I would ask, how do you motivate your team to be so tactically disciplined and always come with very good appraisal of you, even though you have shown them hard love? Yeah.
And that's a great one. And I think, I had a conversation with Sam Walker, who wrote the book The Captain Class, which is all about the greatest sports teams in history. And he was saying how all the great teams had one thing in common, which was an indisposable leader. Oftentimes he was referring to the captain, but the manager obviously plays that role as well. And although I wonder how that question will go down now, seeing as Man United's had a couple of ordinary seasons based on their track record.
Yeah, but I've been a Mourinho supporter ever since it started from Porto, and actually a lot of my management thinking follows a lot on how he thinks about sports teams. I think this is one of that open secrets that apparently a lot of people didn't realize, that I followed a lot on how he thinks about motivating people. How do you design your tactics to a game before, during, and after?
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. And are there any resources or books you recommend people check out to find out more about the mind of Mourinho?
Unfortunately, there isn't a good biography written on him. I think the better biography that I've read so far on One Good Football Manager is the one written by Alex Ferguson himself, called Leading.
Yes.
So I think a lot of what he does, I think Mourinho does very similar in terms of planning. And he has this view, which I thought was interesting, is that leading a football team is not very different from managing a company. And I think a lot of people don't realize that it's not just bringing a team in, win a game, and walk out. There is the before, there is the during, and there is the after.
Yeah.
And everybody sucks after.
Yeah, and the biggest piece to the puzzle oftentimes is managing people and getting the best out of them.
That's right. I think that's the hardest thing to do.
Yeah.
No,
that's a great answer. Great answer. And lucky last, Bernard, is, do you have any rituals or routines that help you stay on top of your game?
Yes. I will meditate 3 minutes a day. I will close my eyes and I'll search my breath. Yeah. That's one. Second, I will read a book 30 minutes a day. No negotiation. That means I would take 30 minutes, probably most likely it's my lunchtime. I would just read 30 minutes. In any book. Yeah.
Any book, doesn't matter what it is.
That's the matter. Because a lot of people always ask me, why do you read books so quickly? And I'm like, well, because I have this habit for a very long time. So I've been reading a lot of books, always on my mind. And the one thing I learned a lot is that a lot of the best CEOs or the best non-executive chairmen of boards that I met are very good readers as well.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And if you look at a lot of the research on, successful people, generally they're up early, they're meditating, they're engaged in some sort of fitness routine, and they're voracious consumers of content. And today with podcasts and audiobooks and ebooks and all the information on the internet, there's no excuse not to be reading or learning something new every day.
Yeah. And one more habit is I run a podcast to actually interview people so that I can learn from them too.
Yes, well, we got carried away talking about SingPost and corporate innovation that we didn't touch too much on Analyse Asia, if at all. So really quickly, I mean, you're the host of Analyse Asia, which now has 210 plus episodes in the past 3 years. You've talked to all manner of people working in corporate innovation, authors, entrepreneurs, with a heavy focus on the Asia region. And, for someone who is obviously quite entrenched in the corporate innovation space, the podcast provides a wealth of value. So really quickly, maybe we can make this the fourth lightning round question. What was your favorite guest of 210 episodes? I know that might be a tough question to answer. It's kind of like saying, who's your favorite child? But who's your favorite guest, and what is the number one thing they taught you?
My favorite guest is Horace Dediu from Simco, because every time I talk to him, I'm having a technology theory knowledge transfer of 2 years done in 3 hours.
Love that.
That's the way to say that. But I have also recently done one interesting interview with Helen Dush and Woman from Leong, Singapore about women leadership in the workplace. That to me is a very challenging interview because I have to put the issues there and being sensitive and empathetic to the cause itself. And I think that this is, even for me who champions these causes, I find it actually very difficult, but I was glad to go through that ordeal. Yeah,
it is a challenging one for a male to have those conversations. Obviously, it is quite sensitive, and how you approach that it has to be done with quite a bit of tact. So, but we will include a link to Analyse Asia in the show notes for our listeners. Listeners should definitely check out the show, but they can also connect with you, Bernard, on Twitter at Analyse Asia, and also on LinkedIn.
Yeah, my Twitter handle is Bernard Leong, BERNARD LEONG. Yeah.
Okay. So Analyse Asia is purely just for the podcast, right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, well, we'll add that to the show notes as well. And they can also find you on LinkedIn, and that's Bernard Leong. So we'll have all of that in the show notes for our listeners. Any parting words of wisdom for our audience, Bernard, when it comes to navigating the minefield that is corporate innovation?
I give this advice to many people, including people who work for me who became very successful as well. Learn from everyone, follow no one, observe the patterns, work like hell.
Love it. Beautiful way to wrap up the show. Thank you so much for giving up the time to chat with the listeners of Future Squared, Bernard.
Have a good day too, Steve. I'm so happy to be on your show. Thank you for having me on.
No problem. Thank you so much. Hey guys, it's Steve again. If you're picking up what we're putting down, we'd love it if you took just a minute of your time to like, share, or subscribe to Future Squared on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Stitcher. It would mean a hell of a lot to the team here who work effortlessly to bring you thought leaders and experts on topics of corporate innovation, entrepreneurship, and self-improvement on a weekly basis. As always, you can find more resources on innovation, including blogs, books, podcasts, videos, webinars, and tools at www.collectivecamp.us. If you'd like to connect with me on Twitter, you can do so at Steve Glaveski. That's Glaveski. Until next time, keep innovating. Future Squared out.